In 1566, if you were a monarch in Europe, or really a chieftain anywhere in North Africa, there was one geopolitical reality that just, well, it dominated your entire world.
Oh, absolutely. The military, the political, the cultural supremacy of the Ottoman Empire.
And for 46 just breathtaking years, Suleiman the Magnificent had presided over its absolute zenith.
You know, the empire at that moment was, without a doubt, the most powerful state on earth. No question. It spanned 3 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa.
Its armies were disciplined, they were technologically advanced, and let's be frank, they were basically unstoppable.
Unstoppable. The wealth of Istanbul was, it was legendary. And you have to remember, European rulers, including the powerful Habsburgs, were often paying tribute.
Just to keep them away.
Just to keep the Ottomans from marching on their capitals. That's the level of power we're talking about.
That shadow was just massive. Terrifying. But what's truly compelling, and maybe the greatest tragedy in all of imperial history, is what happened next. The moment Suleiman the Magnificent died, that seemingly unbreakable momentum, it just started to fade.
And we're not talking about a quick implosion, a sudden dynastic failure or something. This is the ultimate slow-motion catastrophe.
Right.
This is the story of a decline that lasted over 350 agonizing years. It's the story of how a global superpower, which once dictated terms across the entire Mediterranean, slowly, painfully became known as the sick man of Europe.
A prize to be carved up by the very powers it once held in contempt.
Exactly.
And that is our mission today. We are going to explore the internal cancers, the palace intrigues, the rot in the military, and we're going to set those alongside the external military disasters and the desperate, ultimately doomed attempts at reform. This whole 350-year decay fundamentally shaped the modern map of the Middle East and really much of Eastern Europe.
It really is the arc of a classical tragedy. It demonstrates that no institution, no matter how magnificent, is immune to internal entropy.
So let's start right at that alleged turning point, the passing of the warrior king Suleiman in 1566, and the immediate and really startling change in leadership style with his son, Selim II.
Selim II, the successor that Hurrem Sultan had championed and fought so hard to place on the throne. And the historical record immediately gave him a nickname: Selim the Drunkard.
And that nickname, in an empire built on this rigorous, sober piety of the Ghazi warrior tradition, that signals a profound cultural shift right there in Istanbul.
It tells you everything. Selim preferred the comforts and the pleasures of the imperial harem and, yes, the wine cellars, to the demanding, dangerous task of leading armies out in the field.
And this wasn't just about his personal preference, was it? It fundamentally broke the actual mechanism of Ottoman rule.
It broke the machine. The core identity of the Sultan, since the very, very earliest days of the empire, was that of the supreme warrior king, the person who personally led the charge. Selim was the first sultan in the dynasty's long history not to personally take the field.
But why did the physical absence of one man matter so much in what was, a vast, highly functional bureaucratic state? Couldn't the government just run on autopilot, relying on the Grand Vizier?
It couldn't, because the Sultan's presence on campaign served several absolutely critical functions beyond just morale. First, it was the ultimate source of legitimacy for the Janissaries, for the provincial governors. If the Sultan was there, he settled disputes, he issued direct, unquestionable orders.
It prevented factions from getting too powerful.
Exactly. And second, and this is crucial, the early Ottoman Empire was fundamentally a conquest state. Its entire budget, its wealth, was heavily subsidized by the plunder and the tribute gained from continuous successful campaigns.
So when the Sultan stops campaigning, the empire stops conquering. It stops bringing in that massive influx of cash and resources.
Precisely. And it forced an unsustainable transition. The state had to shift from a high-growth, conquest economy to a sort of stable maintenance state funded solely by taxation.
Which is much harder to do.
Much harder. And the centralized bureaucracy, which was already highly susceptible to corruption, was structurally unprepared for this change. Power immediately began to leak away from the disconnected sultan, flowing to the grand viziers, to competing factions in the harem, and most dangerously, to the increasingly autonomous janissaries.
The systemic rot, as you put it, started right at the head. And yet, despite this internal sickness, the empire still possessed this incredible military momentum, which is why the events of 1571 came as such a profound psychological shock to Europe. Let's talk about the Battle of Lepanto.
This happened barely 5 years after Suleiman's death. For decades, the Ottoman navy had utterly dominated the Mediterranean. They considered it their lake.
It was their lake.
But on October 7th, 1571, off the coast of Greece, that naval supremacy was just violently challenged.
And this was Europe's desperate, massive response. It required an unprecedented coalition known as the Holy League.
It brought together nearly every major Christian naval power. We're talking Spain, led by Philip II, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, Malta, Savoy. It was the largest fleet the Christian powers had ever assembled. Over 200 galleys, crewed by 80,000 men, and led by Don John of Austria. The stakes were apocalyptic.
Because if the Ottomans won this, they could have pushed into Italy, maybe taken Rome. They would have certainly made the Western Mediterranean functionally impassable for any European trade or military activity.
The battle itself was brutal. It was fought in the narrow Gulf of Patras, which effectively turned it into a gigantic, 5-hour-long hand-to-hand land battle fought on water.
Just chaos.
Total chaos. Galleys were chained together. Soldiers, including the heavily armored Spanish infantry, boarded the enemy ships in desperate close combat.
And the result for the Ottomans was not just a defeat, it was annihilation.
A military catastrophe. They lost 200 ships, either sunk or captured, and an estimated 30,000 men killed or taken prisoner. The Christian losses, by stark contrast, were minimal, maybe a dozen or so ships. It was a complete, decisive military disaster for the Sultan's fleet.
Now here's where the internal resilience of the empire really reveals itself, because despite this staggering loss, the empire had just seemingly shrugged it off. How did they do that?
Well, it was the sheer scale of their resources and their industrial capacity.
Yeah.
Within 12 months, they had rebuilt the entire fleet.
An entire fleet in 1 year.
They possessed such vast wealth, timber, and manpower that replacing 200 galleys was an immense logistical challenge, but it was achievable.
Yeah.
And this is what gave Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha the confidence to issue that famous retort to the Venetian ambassador.
Right, the Venetian ambassador was celebrating Lepanto as this great permanent victory.
And Sokolu Mehmed Pasha replied with that chilling, brilliant clarity. "You have shaved our beard, it will grow back. We have cut off your arm, it will never regrow."
Meaning that while the Ottomans lost the fleet, Venice, despite winning the Great Battle, still permanently lost the strategic island of Cyprus to the Ottomans just before. For Venice, the loss of territory was the permanent amputation.
And for the empire, the loss of hardware was a temporary issue. It perfectly illustrates the empire's massive operational scale. However, we cannot ignore the psychological blow.
No.
The vizier might have played down the material damage, but Lepanto irrevocably shattered the myth of Ottoman military invincibility in the European mind. For over a century, the fear was existential. After 1571, the European powers knew the Ottomans could be beaten decisively. That shift in strategic calculation changed everything for the next 300 years. It made all the subsequent coordinated counteroffensives possible.
So the empire was functionally surviving these external shocks, but that internal political sickness, the one that started with Selim II refusing to lead, was accelerating. And this brings us to the phenomenon that historians call the Sultanate of Women.
This is a remarkable and really a unique period in the history of global empires. It roughly spans from 1533 to 1656, and it represents the height of the harem's political influence, and perhaps the clearest sign that the power balance in Istanbul had fundamentally inverted.
And the true pioneer of this internal revolution was, of course, Hürrem Sultan, Suleiman's wife.
Hürrem shattered centuries of deeply ingrained tradition. She was the first royal consort to formally marry the Sultan, which broke the rule that the heir's mother had to be a slave. She remained in the palace after her son came of age, and she began directly advising Suleiman on state matters. She set the foundational precedent that women, specifically the Sultan's mother or favorite, could be active, public, and aggressive political players.
And after her, the role of the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, it completely transitioned, didn't it? She wasn't just a figurehead anymore. She was often the operational head of state, particularly when the sultans were minors or, as we'll see, often mentally incapacitated.
And the absolute apex of this female power, the figure who dominated the court for decades, was Kösem Sultan.
Kösem's story is incredible in itself. She was born a slave, likely Greek or Bosnian, and through intelligence and just ruthless maneuvering, she became the favorite of Sultan Ahmed I.
Her foundation of power rested on a simple biological reality. She bore Ahmed multiple sons who survived to adulthood. When Ahmed died, her political career truly began. She became regent for her son, Murad IV, and later for her other son, Ibrahim. In effect, Kosum ruled the Ottoman Empire for well over 30 years.
How exactly did she maintain that level of dominance for so long, especially in such a volatile, dangerous environment?
She was a master strategist of patronage. She cultivated deep, powerful, mutually beneficial alliances with all the key centers of power. The Grand Viziers, the powerful court factions, the conservative religious scholars known as the Ulema, and most crucially, the Janissary Corps. She dispensed massive amounts of gold and land to keep these factions loyal.
And she was brutal.
Absolutely brutal in neutralizing her rivals, often with the same violence that she patronized.
So, while Kosem was an undeniably brilliant politician, the effect on the state itself was, well, it was corrosive. The focus of the central government had fundamentally shifted.
That's the fatal internal consequence. Instead of addressing the massive military and economic gap that was opening up with Europe, the state's energy was consumed by endemic, brutal palace intrigue. Success was measured by who survived the power struggle, not by the efficiency of administration or the success of foreign policy.
And this political environment created the tragic system designed to protect the throne, the Kafes.
The Golden Cage, a perfectly horrible symbol of the state eating itself.
It's deeply tragic. To prevent potential male heirs from challenging the reigning sultan, which was a common problem in earlier centuries, they were confined. The Kafes was a luxurious prison within the Topkapi Palace grounds. They had everything material they could want.
But they were politically and psychologically annihilated.
They spent decades just isolated, cut off from any real-world knowledge of governance, diplomacy, or military strategy, the essential skills for a sultan.
Exactly. They were surrounded only by female servants who were sterilized to prevent the birth of a rival heir, and by deaf-mute guards, ensuring no political information could be communicated or received. They might enter the cafes as boys and emerge as middle-aged men, utterly unprepared to command a global empire. Imagine a prince who has spent 30 years in isolation suddenly being asked to lead an army and manage a budget.
It seems intentionally designed to produce unstable, erratic, and deeply paranoid rulers, which of course brings us to Sultan Ibrahim.
Ibrahim I, who reigned from 1640 to 1648, is the most notorious product of the Kafes. His mental stability was severely damaged by the confinement. Historians describe his paranoia, his obsession with furs and sables, demanding that every surface in his rooms be covered in fur, and his profoundly erratic behavior.
Including the widely reported rumor that he tried to drown his entire harem.
That specific event highlights the chaos. Whether it's true or not, the fact that such an atrocity was believable indicates the level of instability. Ibrahim became so destabilizing that he became a threat to the very power structures that had installed him.
And he was ultimately betrayed and eliminated by them.
Strangled by the Janissaries, reportedly at the direct instigation of his own grandmother, Kosum Sultan, who feared his instability would completely destroy the state. Kosum literally oversaw the elimination of her own grandson for the sake of political expediency.
But Kosum, the powerful matriarch who had ruled for decades, didn't escape the cycle of violence herself.
No, she was later strangled in 1651 by the supporters of her rival, Turhan Sultan, the mother of the new boy sultan, Mehmed IV. The Sultanate of Women was a period defined by extraordinary female power, but ultimately it was power turned inward, consumed by brutal and distracting palace coups. While the royal courts of England, France, and Sweden were consolidating power and investing in science and colonial expansion, the Ottoman Empire was engaging in regicide and internal purges.
That political distraction and internal self-destruction provided the window the Europeans desperately needed. By the mid-17th century, the empire was still formidable, still capable of enormous strategic moves, which culminated in one final massive attempt to reverse the tide of history.
The 1683 Siege of Vienna. This was the definitive moment where the Ottoman Empire wagered everything on a single, massive gamble to restore its status as the world's leading power.
And Vienna had always been that great uncaptured prize, the city that eluded Suleiman a century and a half before, who made the fateful decision to try again.
It was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was exceptionally ambitious and viewed Vienna as the key to establishing Ottoman dominance over Central Europe. He saw the weakness of the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I, and he pushed for total commitment.
And the scale of this commitment was just staggering.
It was immense. Kara Mustafa assembled what was perhaps the largest Ottoman army ever put into the field. Approximately 150,000 men. This wasn't just an expeditionary force. It was a movement intended to occupy and integrate vast new territories. His ambition was to smash the Habsburgs completely and potentially push the border to the Rhine River.
It's hard to overstate the civilizational importance of this. If Vienna had fallen, the subsequent history of Europe would be unrecognizable.
A total transformation. When the army arrives in July 1683, the siege began immediately. Emperor Leopold fled, leaving the defense of the city to a desperate garrison of only about 15,000 soldiers and armed citizens, led by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg.
So they're outnumbered 10-1, fighting a highly skilled siege force.
And Karl Mustafa was an expert at siege warfare. The Ottomans were renowned sappers. They dug trenches and tunnels right up to and under the ancient medieval walls, packing them with explosives. The defenders were forced to countermine, leading to brutal, claustrophobic hand-to-hand combat, fought in pitch-black underground tunnels below the streets of Vienna.
For 2 months, supplies running out, morale plummeting. By early September, Vienna was on the absolute brink.
It was hours away from collapse. The mines were about to breach the main bastions. Karl Mustafa believed victory was inevitable and decided to wait out the final moments rather than risk a bloody frontal assault, a decision that cost him everything.
Because relief was on the way, led by the man history would call the savior of Christendom,
King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. He assembled a massive coalition of Polish, Austrian, and German forces. The pressure was enormous, and he risked everything to march his army across hundreds of miles in record time to reach the city.
And the battle that followed on September 12, 1683, is truly the stuff of legend.
The coalition army positioned itself high on the Kahlenberg Hills, overlooking the entire Ottoman camp. The Ottomans, confident in their victory, were entirely unprepared for a flanking attack of this magnitude. At 4 p.m., Sobieski gave the order for the largest cavalry charge in human history.
18,000 horsemen descending from the hills.
Including those iconic, terrifying Polish wing hussars, 3,000 of them, often described as the shock troops of Europe. The sheer momentum and spectacle of the charge, the wind whistling through their huge feathered wings, the thunder of the hooves, was enough to break the already panicked Ottoman ranks.
It was more than a charge, it was a total rout.
Complete devastation. The Ottoman army broke and fled instantly. They abandoned their entire camp, their treasury, thousands of cannons, and the symbol of their arrogance. Karl Mustafa's opulent personal tent. The psychological impact of losing everything, including the Grand Vizier's personal effects, was crippling.
And Karl Mustafa was later found and strangled by the Sultan's order for his failure.
Yes, but the defeated Vienna wasn't an isolated event. It opened the door to continuous European counteroffensive, leading to the first major loss of territory.
Absolutely. The failure at Vienna sparked the Great Turkish War, which lasted 16 continuous years. Europe, knowing the myth of invincibility was now shattered, pressed its advantage ruthlessly.
And the end result was the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699.
Karlowitz is a watershed moment of historical significance.
It really is. For the first time in its 400-year history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede vast, substantial territory to Christian European powers. They lost Hungary, Transylvania, Slavonia, Podolia, and parts of Greece and Dalmatia. The military dynamic had completely reversed. The empire was no longer the aggressor. It was the power in permanent retreat and defense.
So expansion is over. The state must now focus on defense and adaptation. But the empire's ability to adapt was being crippled by its own core military institution, the Janissaries.
The Janissary Problem is perhaps the single most potent symbol of internal institutional failure. They started as the empire's elite, fearsome slave soldiers, the cutting edge of Ottoman power recruited through the Devshirme, completely loyal to the Sultan.
And they devolved into this cancerous, corrupt military caste that actively prevented the empire from making the necessary reforms to survive the modern age.
The shift was gradual but devastating. The Devshirme system, that levy of Christian boys, was phased out. The core became hereditary. Members married, raised families, and passed their titles down. They stopped training seriously. And, critically, they leveraged their military status to become incredibly powerful merchants, businessmen, and tax farmers.
So if they were running businesses and controlling tax collection, they were financially invested in preventing efficient modern governance.
Precisely. They were invested in the status quo of their privilege. A modern centralized state with a professional army would threaten their monopolies, their tax farming rackets, and their political extortion. Their loyalty became tied entirely to their pay and privileges, not the survival of the state.
So when the sultans of the 18th and early 19th centuries realized they had to close the technology gap with Europe, adopting new artillery, new drill, new tactics, the Janissaries acted as the ultimate conservative bloc.
They did. Reform attempts were constantly blocked by the Janissaries, who instigated revolts and coups whenever their power base was threatened. This culminated in the ultimate act of treason against the state.
The fate of Sultan Selim III.
Selim III was one of the first sultans to genuinely grasp the gravity of the empire's technological deficit. He attempted to create the Nizam-i-Seated, or the New Order Army, trained and equipped along modern European lines. The Janissaries viewed this new army as an existential threat to their power. They revolted, marched on the palace, and executed Selim III in 1807.
They killed the leader who was trying to save them from military irrelevance. That is institutional self-destruction at its most profound.
It secured their immediate power, but it guaranteed the long-term weakness of the empire. This act taught the succeeding sultan, Mahmud II, a terrifying lesson. The empire could not be saved unless the Janissary core was completely eradicated.
Mahmud II spent years meticulously planning, secretly building loyal forces that could match the Janissaries, leading to the infamous Auspicious Incident of 1826.
It was a cold, calculated move. Mahmud II cleverly provoked the Janissaries into a final suicidal rebellion by announcing a new training regiment that directly challenged their tradition. Knowing they would react violently, he waited until they amassed in the barracks in Istanbul, demanding the heads of his ministers.
And then came the massacre.
Mahmud II unleashed his loyal artillery forces on the Janissary barracks. The bombardment was methodical and brutal. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in the initial assault, and the survivors were relentlessly hunted down and executed across the empire. The very institution that had conquered Constantinople and symbolized Ottoman power was destroyed by the empire itself in a desperate act of necessary amputation.
A horrifying, but perhaps essential, internal purge. Yet even after this drastic measure, the empire was already facing the most corrosive external force of the age: nationalism.
The 19th century became an era of terminal hemorrhaging. The Ottoman Empire was a vast multi-ethnic mosaic: Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Arabs, Armenians, Kurds. Once nationalism took root, it was only a matter of time before they sought independence.
And the Greeks were the first successful breakaway state.
The Greek War of Independence, starting in 1821, captured the imagination of liberal Europe. Poets like Lord Byron became martyrs for the cause of Philhellenism, seeing it as the rebirth of classical Greece.
And by 1832, Greece achieved full independence. That was a huge psychological blow, wasn't it? It proved that the empire could be defeated and dismembered by its own subject populations with the backing of European powers.
Exactly. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria quickly followed suit, achieving autonomy or independence throughout the century. The map of the Balkans was being rapidly redrawn at the expense of the Sultan.
And the empire wasn't just shrinking in Europe. Even the core Arab provinces were becoming autonomous or outright hostile.
The case of Egypt under Muhammad Ali is astonishing. He was an Albanian Ottoman governor who essentially made himself de facto independent. He built a professional modern army, one of the few successful modernizations in the Ottoman sphere. And he became so powerful that in the 1830s, his forces threatened to march on Istanbul itself.
A vassal nearly overthrew the Sultan.
It took direct military and diplomatic intervention by Great Britain, who were terrified of Russia moving into the vacuum, to force Muhammad Ali to retreat and save the Sultanate. The irony is that the Ottoman Empire was now being sustained temporarily, not by its own strength, but by the rivalries of its enemies.
And this is the context in which Tsar Nicholas I of Russia delivered that famous, utterly humiliating diagnosis.
The sick man of Europe. The Tsar, in conversation with the British, essentially declared that the patient was dying, and the major powers should stop worrying about curing him and start discussing how to divide his inheritance. The phrase perfectly captured the geopolitical reality. The European great powers were circling, waiting for the final collapse.
The diagnosis was out, and the empire was fighting for its life. The Ottomans knew they couldn't survive without reform, leading to the serious, though desperate, attempts known as the Tanzimat.
The Tanzimat, meaning reorganization, starting in 1839, was a profound and arguably the most genuine attempt by the Ottoman leadership to save the state. The reformers' men, like Mustafa Rashid Pasha and Ali Pasha, recognized that the traditional structure was just incapable of competing with European modernity.
So they attempted to completely restructure the state bureaucracy, legal codes, and society along European lines. What were the most revolutionary elements for a conservative Muslim empire?
The legal and social equality. They pushed for the equality of all citizens before the law, regardless of religious affiliation. This was a radical break from the traditional Islamic millet system, which granted distinct rights and duties based on religious community. They also established modern secular schools alongside the traditional religious schools and created comprehensive new legal codes, essentially replacing centuries of custom and religious law with modern codified civil law.
And the goal was to create a unified, modern Ottoman identity to counteract rising nationalism, correct?
Precisely. They hoped that by granting these rights and creating a unified secular framework, the Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Arabs would feel invested in the survival of the empire as Ottoman citizens, rather than just distinct ethnic groups ruled by Istanbul.
And this modernizing trend reached its peak with the promulgation of the Ottoman Constitution.
The Ottoman Constitution of 1876. It established a bicameral parliament and declared the equality of all subjects. It was genuinely liberal and really ahead of its time. But it was short-lived, lasting only 2 tumultuous years before the forces of reaction and absolutism regained control.
Enter Sultan Abdülhamid II.
Abdülhamid II saw the reforms, the liberalism, the parliament as symptomatic of the empire's weakness. He believed only absolute iron-fisted rule could provide the necessary stability to delay the final breakup. He suspended the constitution in 1878 and ruled as an autocrat for 30 years.
How did he manage to maintain control for 3 decades in an era defined by political instability?
Through repression, centralization, and a powerful secret police apparatus. He used censorship extensively, stifled dissent, and relied on absolute loyalty to the throne. Paradoxically, while he suppressed liberal reforms, he continued some modernization in infrastructure, like the Hejaz Railway, because he realized that military strength and internal communication were key. He also tried to use pan-Islamism, appealing to the religious loyalties of his Muslim subjects worldwide, to distract from the rising tide of ethnic nationalism.
So he delayed the collapse, but he stifled the very political evolution that might have provided a long-term cure.
He bought time, but at the cost of bottling up the pressure. By 1900, the empire was reduced primarily to Anatolia, the Straits, and the Arab provinces, a geographic echo of its former glory.
And the pressure cooker inevitably exploded with the rise of the Young Turks.
These were educated, reformist military officers, desperate to emulate the military and political success of nations like Germany. In 1908, they launched a bloodless coup, forcing Abdülhamid II to restore the constitution. They were driven by a passionate, almost frantic belief that if they modernized rapidly and unified the state under a liberal banner, they could still save the empire.
They took the keys to a sinking ship, didn't they? Because almost immediately after they took power, the true fatal blows began to fall.
They inherited a catastrophe. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 delivered the final, irreversible geographical humiliation.
This is where 500 years of European presence just disappeared in a matter of months.
In mere months. The newly independent Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, combined forces and stripped the empire of almost everything it had left in Europe. Albania, Macedonia, Thrace. The humiliating speed of the defeat demonstrated that even the Young Turk regime was too late. Their modern armies were no match for the concerted action of smaller but focused national armies.
So, by 1914, the Ottoman Empire was severely weakened, territorially reduced, and internally humiliated. They faced an impossible choice regarding the looming world war.
It truly was the ultimate desperate gamble. The leadership, primarily Enver Pasha, felt they had 2 options. Either remain neutral, which they believed would lead to Britain and France carving them up anyway after the war, or ally with a major power, win the war, and hopefully reclaim the territories lost in the Balkans and the Caucasus.
They chose the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Yes, a decision often characterized by ambition and naivete. The Ottomans formally entered the war after the German warships, Goeben and Breslau, which were being chased by the British, sailed into Istanbul and were sold to the Ottoman Navy. This effectively forced the issue, and for the next 4 years, the empire was engaged in a war far beyond its exhausted capacity.
And while the war was a general catastrophe for the Ottomans, there were moments of incredible defining resilience, particularly the defense of the Straits.
The single most important victory of the entire war was Gallipoli in 1915. The British and French launched a massive amphibious operation intended to force the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and open a supply line to Russia. If successful, the war on the Eastern Front might have ended years earlier.
But the Ottomans held firm.
They fought with legendary ferocity, transforming the peninsula into a brutal stalemate. The Allied forces took massive casualties and were ultimately forced to withdraw. This victory not only saved the capital, but created a national hero in the process.
Mustafa Kemal.
A young, brilliant, and incredibly determined officer. His tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire his men in the defense of the heights above the beaches made him an immediate, undisputed national icon, setting the stage for everything that followed.
Yet Gallipoli was an exception. On every other front, the war was a
A
disaster.
total protracted disaster. The Russian front in the Caucasus was brutal. The British invaded Mesopotamia and captured Baghdad. And then there was the fatal fragmentation caused by the Arab Revolt.
Encouraged and supported by figures like T.E. Lawrence or Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence and the British promises of an independent Arab state convinced the Arab chieftains, particularly the Hashemites, to rise up against the Sultan's rule. This revolt tied down huge numbers of Ottoman troops in the Hejaz and Syria, making the defense of those vital provinces impossible. By 1918, the empire was utterly broken, financially ruined, and militarily defeated.
The Ottoman Empire officially surrendered, and Allied troops occupied Istanbul, the historic capital of the Caliphate. The victors were ready to execute the death warrant they had been preparing for a century.
They formalized their intentions in the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. This treaty represented the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman state, designed to reduce Turkey to a small, landlocked rump state in central Anatolia.
What were the specific terms of this final planned death sentence?
They were draconian. Greece was granted the right to occupy the strategically vital port city of Smyrna and surrounding areas, essentially placing a large Greek population deep into Anatolia. Independence was granted to Armenia in the east, and autonomy was promised to the Kurds. The critical straits connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean were to be permanently internationalized, stripping Turkish sovereignty over its own capital.
But the empire did not die according to the treaty. It experienced a final, desperate, violent rebirth in the form of a nationalist movement.
Because of the man who saved Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal. He recognized that the Sultan, under Allied occupation, was a puppet who had accepted the terms of Sevres. Kemal refused to accept the death of the Turkish homeland. He mobilized the nationalist remnants of the Ottoman army in Anatolia, rejected the Sultan's authority, and launched the Turkish War of Independence.
This was a desperate fight against overwhelming odds and several different occupying forces.
It was a brutal total war fought against the Greeks, who pushed deep into Anatolia under the mandate of Sevres. He fought the French and Italians in the south and the Armenians in the east. For 3 years, Kemal wielded a fragmented, demoralized populace into a disciplined fighting force dedicated to defending Anatolia.
And he secured a triumphantly decisive victory.
The peak moment came in 1922, when Kemal's forces decisively defeated the Greek army, driving them out of Anatolia and into the sea at Smyrna, a moment of massive national triumph. This military success forced the Allies to the negotiating table once again, effectively rendering the Treaty of Sevres obsolete.
Leading to the Treaty of Lausanne.
Lausanne, signed in 1923, recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish nation over Anatolia and eastern Thrace. It established the borders of the modern Republic of Turkey and secured Turkish control over the crucial straits. It was an unprecedented diplomatic victory for a technically defeated power.
But in Mustafa Kemal's vision of a modern secular nation-state, there was no longer any place for the centuries-old institution of the Ottoman Sultanate.
No place whatsoever. Kemal and the Grand National Assembly recognized that the Sultanate was a symbol of the old, broken, and defeated system. On November 1st, 1922, the Assembly formally abolished the Sultanate, ending 623 years of continuous dynastic rule.
The final physical act of departure must have been steeped in history and profound melancholia.
Mehmed VI, the 36th and last Ottoman Sultan, fled Istanbul just 11 days after the abolition. He departed quietly on a British warship, sailing into exile. 623 years of history, from the dream of Osman through the conquest of Constantinople to the magnificence of Suleiman, ended, not with a massive unifying battle, but with a quiet, final exile.
That is the story of the fall. But empires, even when they're dust, leave behind ghosts. The consequences of this collapse still profoundly shape our modern world, particularly the Middle East.
The immediate, inescapable legacy is the map itself. When the empire disintegrated, the great powers, primarily Britain and France, took control of the territories and, through agreements like Sykes-Picot, drew the modern borders of the Arab Middle East: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine.
And these lines were drawn arbitrarily, often without regard for the existing ethnic or religious communities that had coexisted, however uneasily, under Ottoman rule for centuries.
That is the core issue that defines the region's instability today. The new European mandates combined historically divergent groups into single new states, such as creating Iraq from three distinct Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, Basra, or conversely, they divided natural communities, scattering the Kurds across the borders of four different states.
So when we look at major modern conflicts, the Syrian civil war, the instability in Iraq, the Kurdish aspirations for statehood, the complex history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they all trace their geopolitical roots directly back to the division of the Ottoman inheritance a century ago.
Absolutely. The vacuum created by the removal of the long-standing, often flawed Ottoman administrative framework was filled by European mandates, which prioritized imperial control over local communal stability. The conflicts we see today are, in many ways, the long-tail consequences of that division.
Yet the legacy is not purely one of conflict and dissolution. There is the profound positive inheritance, the cultural and architectural grandeur that defines much of the region.
You cannot visit Istanbul without feeling the enduring weight of the Ottoman achievement. The skyline, those soaring minarets and vast, impossibly beautiful domes, the Blue Mosque, the Hagia Sophia, the Suleimaniye Mosque, these are indelible Ottoman creations that define the city.
And the cultural synthesis the empire managed for so long must be acknowledged.
It was a massive crucible blending Persian imperial tradition, Arab administrative and religious thought, Turkish military might, and Greek and Slavic cultural influences into a unique and incredibly complex civilization that maintained order across three continents for half a millennium. Istanbul remains one of the world's great, enduring cities because of that inheritance.
Okay, let's step back one last time and view this 623-year history as a classical tragedy. What is the ultimate unifying lesson about the nature of power and collapse?
I think the ultimate lesson is that great power carries the seeds of its own destruction. The Ottomans built an administrative, military, and political system that was flawless for conquest and expansion, but they failed the ultimate test: the ability to change the system while it was still functional.
They prioritized internal maintenance, protecting the power of the Janissaries, preserving the entrenched privilege of the harem factions over the urgent necessity of external adaptation to a changing world.
That's the core tragedy. When the external world modernized through the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman system was too rigid, too internally invested in its own status quo to pivot. And in the end, like all empires that failed to adapt, they became dust.
It is an incredibly compelling and melancholic narrative. From the moment the walls of Constantinople fell to the moment the walls of Vienna held firm. From Osman's dream of a world-spanning tree to the 36th Sultan quietly sailing away into history.
A journey that encompasses the entire sweep of the transition from the medieval era to the modern world and the brutal lessons of geopolitical evolution.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, as you reflect on the fate of this monumental empire. If the Ottoman tragedy was rooting in the prioritization of internal institutional privilege, the harem and the janissaries over necessary external change, what is the fundamental internal flaw inherent in modern systems of power, political or corporate, that guarantees they too will eventually fail to adapt and succumb to systemic entropy?
Something to consider as you observe the structures of power around you.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive deep dive into the slow death of the Ottoman superpower.
Until next time.